Tragedy, it's been expressed so many times, our condolences and particularly to Mr. Petty and Mr. Posada for the traumatic experiences that you've gone through. I couldn't imagine what they are, but you're here to speak on those, so I'll start with you, Mr. Petty, and then Ms. Posada, and then Mr. Beckerman.
Great, Mr. Chairman. Madam Ranking Member and the committee members, thank you for having me here today. I'd like to share a quick statement from the families, and then I'll begin my personal statement. The families of the amazing children and teachers killed at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School on Valentine's Day would like to recognize the first responders who were witnesses that day to an unspeakable evil. Many acted heroically, putting themselves in harm's way, and saved many lives that day. Thank you. To the caring and gracious people of the cities of Parkland, Coral Springs, the citizens of our home state of Florida, and those across America who have shown support for us in our time of sorrow and loss, we can only say thank you. Please know that your kindness and support is deeply appreciated and has made a lasting impact on our lives. As families, we came from different backgrounds and we hold a variety of viewpoints. Yet we united around this simple idea: our children and teachers should be safe at school. We rallied to the battle cry, "This time must be different." We came together to build on common ground, and we made history in Florida by passing legislation to achieve a first step in just 3 weeks. It was a good start, but it is not enough. There's much more to be done. Now to my personal statement. In a season of loss, it is difficult to find meaning in tragedy. The senseless murder of so many, including my own beloved daughter Elena, tests the limits of faith and demands more endurance than we thought possible. It is a test abruptly forced on us, and we bear it the best we can. Each of us, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, wives of those lost and loved, strive to find that meaning. I believe we will be seeking it to the end of our days. However, our abiding faith tells us that our Father in heaven has a plan. Although the loss of our daughter Elena was to us unforeseen, it was not a surprise to him. This gives us comfort during this difficult time. We will not know what this all means until that time, but we know that this thing that has happened does not mean what this does not mean. It does not mean evil will triumph. It does not mean we may do nothing. It does not mean we should turn against one another. We must not struggle over ashes in the shadow of our grief. So instead of the media-fed, activist-inflamed, and politically aggravated din of the past month, I speak today about the real and substantive legislative and policy achievements we made in the state of Florida, earned at an unimaginable cost. And I'll share a few ideas on how the United States Congress can emulate and expand upon those accomplishments. The steps taken by Governor Scott and enacted by the Florida legislature have little to do with opportunistic agitation launched in the wake of the Parkland killings. They serve no political agenda. But they do serve the people's agenda because they build on common ground. They are inclusive rather than divisive. Americans are deeply interested in safe schools, in caring communities, and in secure neighborhoods. As family of one of the victims, we've learned at great personal cost that Americans can come together. Policy and political action ought to take their cues from this American majority. We do not have to all agree on guns, and we won't. But we can agree on the most fundamental things. We can agree that students and teachers should be safe. We can agree that schools should be secure. We can agree that law enforcement should be competent and must do its job. I want to focus on that briefly on that last point especially. Nicholas Cruz and the deadly danger he posed were the worst kept secrets in Parkland, with one inexcusable exception. He was kept a secret from many of the parents of the students of Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School. Yet every relevant authority knew he was deeply troubled with the potential for lethal violence. The foster system knew it, the FBI knew it, the school district knew it, and the Broward County Sheriff's Department knew it. Yet despite the fact that each of these agencies were fully authorized and empowered to take action well before tragedy struck, not one of them fulfilled their duty. The testament of their failure is 17 dead children and teachers, 17 more with life-altering injuries, a burden we must bear forever. Add to this failure the failure to warn the parents of the students. By this action or inaction, we were rendered powerless to fulfill our most sacred trust as parents, to protect our children. Forgive me then, if I do not believe government is the ultimate solution. Our trust in our institutions and our office holders is deeply shaken. Our broken hearts cry out every moment of every day for the rest of our lives. So what is the solution? The legislation passed in Florida is a good start, and there must be more done to secure our schools. Legislation being considered in this body will continue on the efforts begun in Florida, and I call on Congress to pass this legislation. Follow the lead of what has been accomplished in Florida. Build on common ground. But it is not the whole solution. The problem of man against evil is as old as humanity itself, and we cannot face it alone. If we think of school violence as a disease, we would not just treat the symptoms or only don protective gear to avoid accidental exposure. We must learn to identify these troubled youth before they turn violent and get them the help they desperately need. We can look to programs like the Safe UT program in Utah or the work being done by the LA County schools to identify potential threats. As we heard earlier, even the U.S. Secret Service has studied school shooters and defined 6 common characteristics which can aid in identification and interdiction. Identification and interdiction has become my mission. Not one that I ever wanted, but one I accept in Elena's name. And I will see it through. Ultimately, the solution is not in any single policy, not in any piece of legislation, and not in any activist's fervent prescription. It is in our hearts. We can try to stop the next Nicholas Cruz with better screening, with competent law enforcement, and with better security. Sometimes we will succeed, but sometimes those measures alone will fail. Where we really need to stop the next killer is in our homes, in our communities, and through our faith. The best defense against the next Nicholas Cruz is in building up strong families where love can be shown to a hurting child. It is in the care we show to a struggling or overwhelmed neighbor. It is in the charity we extend to a stranger. It is in the comfort we give a wounded heart. It is in the kindness we show to an isolated, struggling young man. It is in the reflection of God that we have in ourselves. That isn't within the power of this Congress or any body of men to give or command. But it is within each of us. Until we as a society understand that, our efforts will continue to fall short. It is my hope that senseless tragic events like the one that took my dear daughter will awaken people across our nation that we need to work collectively to create a significant cultural shift. I hope we do. If we do, it will be the part of us that is most like Elena. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Petty. Ms. Posada.
Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Feinstein, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today. On Valentine's Day, my 4th period English honors class was discussing Act 3 of Shakespeare's Macbeth when the fire alarm sounded. We started to evacuate, but we were quickly told that it was a code red, which means that there is threat to safety inside the school, and everyone should shelter in place. I never imagined that there was truly anything wrong. I got my students back into my classroom, into the corner where we couldn't be seen from the small window in the door, and waited for what I assumed was a drill to end. We had no idea that just a couple hundred yards away, Nicholas Cruz had just fired over 100 bullets from an AR-15 assault-style rifle, killing 17 people and injuring another 17. Our first clue that something was really wrong was a phone call one of my students got from his sister, who was in the freshman building. She told him she had seen someone with a gun in the hallway and heard several shots. My student, a 6-foot-tall football player, started crying, worried for his sister's safety. I helped him calm down, reassuring him that if she could call him, it must mean that she was all right. I started to go into panic mode, but I struggled to keep it together for my students, knowing that if I lost it, they would lose it too. Then the texts started. Parents, neighbors, even almost strangers texted us, making sure we were okay, asking us what had happened. We told them we were safe, but we couldn't answer their other questions. We didn't know what was happening. Some of my students had left their cell phones on their desks, but I wouldn't let them go across the room to get them. What if the shooter was in the hallway, waiting to see movement in the classroom? As a parent myself, I could only imagine the fear their parents must have been feeling, not being able to get in touch with their kids. I texted their mothers from my own phone, assuring them that their children were okay, sending them pictures as proof. People from outside the school told us the rumors they were seeing on the news. There was an active shooter on our campus. At least 2 people were dead. As time went on, the rumors changed. Police suspected that there were 2 or 3 shooters. None had been apprehended. The death toll kept rising. 3 dead, 7 dead. I kept reminding my students that we couldn't believe everything we heard. No one seemed to know what was really happening. The truth was that I didn't want to believe it. I was in shock. I think we all were. We sat in the corner of my classroom until after 5 o'clock that day, trying to be as quiet as possible, trying to reassure our friends and family for our safety, and trying not to panic. After what seemed like an eternity, we heard voices in the hallway outside my room. Men were shouting, but we couldn't understand them. We didn't know if they were the police or if they might be the shooters. We heard them trying keys in the door, a good sign, but I wondered if whoever it was had shot someone and stolen their keys. I stood up in front of my students and faced the door, hoping these would be the good guys. Thankfully, they were. My students and I were lucky that day. My classroom is on the opposite side of campus from the 1200 building, and although we were terrified, we were never in any immediate danger. Others, of course, were not so lucky. Not only did we lose 17 of our own, hundreds of others were scarred from this experience. Students in my other classes who were in the freshman building that day have shared some of their stories with me, and the things they saw and heard will stay with them forever. Many of them saw friends die and had to step over bodies and pools of blood to get out of their classrooms. Loud noises, even the bells between classes, make them jump. I had a girl ask me if she could stand with her back to the wall because she didn't feel safe sitting in the desk in the middle of a classroom, not knowing what was behind her. Dwayne Wade, a professional basketball player, came to our school for what should have been a fun treat for the kids in the midst of their grief, but many were triggered by the shouts of excitement that erupted when he walked onto campus. They were too similar to the screams of terror they heard just a few short weeks ago. These kids will be dealing with this trauma for years to come. And yet the Marjory Stoneman Douglas students have been stronger than teenagers should ever have to be. They have gone through the worst, most traumatizing experience imaginable, and instead of collapsing under the immense pressure, they have focused on channeling their anger and grief into something positive. And they have succeeded. They have succeeded in getting gun control legislation passed in Florida, a state that hadn't passed similar legislation in over 2 decades. The Marjory Stoneman Douglas Act certainly isn't perfect. The idea of putting more guns into schools in order to reduce gun violence seems to me like an idea that can only end in more tragedy. But the many other provisions in the bill make it a great step in the right direction, and it proves that what I tell my students is true. Their actions can change the world. I got into teaching because I wanted to inspire students, but now they are inspiring me. The issues surrounding mass shootings in this country are complex, and to pretend otherwise is naive and continues to put the general public, especially our children, in danger. People have suggested that this is a mental health issue. Some have suggested that it is a school safety issue. I agree with both of those statements. We do need better resources for the mentally ill in our country, not just to prevent mass shootings, but to work together for a better quality of life for the thousands of people who suffer from these mental illnesses. We do need to increase safety in our schools to protect our children against those who would want to harm them. But to say that the issue of mass shootings isn't also a gun issue is absurd. I cannot imagine a scenario in which Nicholas Cruz could have come to my school armed with a different type of weapon, such as a knife, and murdered 17 innocent people. Some of the victims were shot through doors or even through walls. A knife can't do that. Even a handgun would not have been able to cause such carnage. The style of gun he used has been a weapon of choice in so many mass shootings in recent history. How many innocent lives could have been saved if these weapons of war weren't so readily available? While increased funding for mental health programs and school security will no doubt have positive effects, mass shootings will not stop until we rid society of the weapons that make them possible. Please help us protect our children by addressing all facets of this issue and considering common sense gun laws. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Posada. In your written statement, you state that, quote, "The Americans aren't interested in surrendering or curtailing their constitutional rights," end of quote. You also argued that Americans can agree on some fundamental principles, namely that students and teachers should be safe, schools should be secure, and law enforcement should be competent and do their job. What, in your view, is the most effective way to prevent school shootings?
My concern, Senator, is that we go down the path that we've gone down after every mass shooting and every school shooting, and we inevitably end up in a debate over the Second Amendment. I've heard arguments already here today in front of this committee. It's a topic that we don't all agree on. It's quite divisive. My view is that the best way we can prevent school shootings, first of all, I think the first step is to improve the security at our schools. That's something I think we can all agree on. The kids should be safe, the teachers should be safe, the parents shouldn't have to worry about sending their kids to school. So I'd like to see us act there first. And then beyond that, I really think the best way to, despite what happened in Parkland and what we're learning, early identification and interdiction seems to me to be the best way to prevent these from happening. And as a part of that, as I said in my testimony, if we can identify these potential violent actors, these school shooters, and get them the help they need, help them understand who they are, and that they don't have to resort to violence, I think to me that is the best way to prevent these.
Yeah. No, my next question you may have already answered by what you just said, but I thought I ought to have the benefit of your judgment since you've gone through such a tragedy, as if you had the best thing that Congress could do to honor your daughter's legacy and memory. Or maybe you've already stated it.
That this never happens again.
Okay. I'd like to ask you another question. I understand that you have a background in technology. News accounts and transcripts released by the FBI inform us that the shooter made a number of alarming posts. But while social media companies have cooperated with all law enforcement requests related to the Parkland shooting, it also appears that they did not tip law enforcement off about the alarming content. In your view, how should tech companies respond to alarming content posted by their users? And then I'll go to Senator Feinstein.
I think it's a difficult question to answer, and I appreciate the testimony that's given by Mr. Beckman today that the first thing is to identify troubling content and then get it in front of, as much as I trust and know that AI is improving, I still think at some point it needs to be viewed and reviewed in context by a human being, and then law enforcement needs to be informed, and hopefully they'll do their job.
Chairman, I want to make just one comment to Mr. Petty, and my heart and thoughts are with you. But I would make this comment. I went to public school, kindergarten through 8th grade. There was never such a thing as a shooting in school. And there was never such a thing as an assault weapon. As long as you have these weapons easily available, I believe you cannot stop these shootings. And I have followed it as closely as I can for the last quarter of a century, reading everything, trying to be as educated as I might be. But I might just say to you, that is really my conclusion. I've been asked to mention, and I've given letters to the chairman from the national teachers unions to reference their concerns outlined in the possibility of teachers being armed. And I'd like to point out that the president of the American Federation of Teachers, Randy Weingarten, has stated that they are strongly opposed, that they believe this proposal to harden schools and to arm teachers is straight out of the NRA playbook and antithetical to the needs of children and ignores the purposes of public education. Similarly, National Education Association President Lily Garcia has said our students, and this is their position, need more books, art, and music, nurses and school counselors. They do not need more guns in their classrooms. If I could ask the gentleman representing the internet companies, is there any content threatening violence or killing that your industry would flag or take down?
Absolutely. Our companies, the policies vary very much by company and platform and what's appropriate, but all content threatening violence is in a violation of their policies and does get removed in time.
Are you telling me that companies, Twitter, Facebook, whatever it is, would take any threat down?
Senator, again, it depends on the circumstance. As I mentioned, some of these things are very nuanced. There could be something, the exact same text that could be a credible threat, could also be...
Well, today, how about the comment made by this shooter that he wanted to be a school shooter?
That was removed.
The industry removed it?
It was removed by the person that was moderating that video.
And that,
on YouTube.
Who would that be?
I want to be careful not to get too much into the details, as they're obviously doing an investigation still, but as been reported publicly, the gentleman who had the video where the post was made both flagged it and removed it before any action was taken, and also he called law enforcement and flagged it for law enforcement, as was noted by the FBI in the previous panel.
Well, thank you. We'll check that out. That's helpful to know. Ms. Posada, let me thank you for your career in education, and let me thank you for what you've gone through and your spirit and strength. It is very impressive. What lessons have you taken out of this with respect to what you believe we should do?
Well, I don't think that there is a simple solution. I think if there were a simple solution, we wouldn't be here right now. We would have done it. There have been enough of these occurrences in our past that if it were simple to fix it, it would have been done. Unfortunately, it's not. So I think that, we do need more funding. We do need more communication between law enforcement and the different agencies of law enforcement, local, federal, also between technology companies, things like that. We have all of these resources. They're just not quite making the connections between them. And we need to figure out how we do that. What's the best way to do that? But the fact that these weapons are out there on our streets, that they exist, that a 19-year-old can go into a gun store and buy a semi-automatic weapon and a high capacity magazine, thank you. The fact that he could do that is insane to me that that's something that people have access to. Whether you are mentally ill, as this person may have been or not, no one needs that kind of weapon. There's no purpose to that kind of gun other than to shoot as many bullets into people in a short amount of time as possible. And I think that until we take these guns away, there's really no way that we can completely prevent these things from happening, unfortunately.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Durbin.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel. Mr. Petty, I wasn't here as you made your statement, but I read it in its entirety. It's touching, and I know it came from your heart, and our hearts are with you and your family at this time of loss. You talk about reaching out to these young people before they reach the point where they're dangerous, and thank you. That is a noble statement from a person as suffered as your family has suffered. I'm focusing on trauma and the impact of trauma on children. And when I find gun violence in Chicago and go into the jails and ask about these teenagers, most all of them have been victims of violent trauma or have witnessed trauma and they're changed by it and they need help. And I'm glad you made that point. Ms. Posada, I want to ask you something you may not be able to answer, but I reflect on it a lot. Why? Why did this incident on February 14th have such an impact on America? It's not the first mass shooting by any means. It's not the first shooting in a school by any means. Sadly, it's not. But this seems to have been a breaking point, a tipping point. And I don't know if it's because of the students at your school or America. What do you think? Was it just this horrible thing occurred at a moment when people were open, or was it something special about the students and the circumstances?
I think number one, the biggest difference has been our students. We come from a great school system, and our school, I'm a proud teacher at our school, and it's a wonderful school. We have excellent teachers, and they have prepared these kids. We didn't know we were preparing them for a tragedy like this. We didn't know that we were preparing them to deal with this kind of thing on such a wide, national scale. But we did. And the fact that they have been able to take this horrible event and really find themselves called to make a difference, I think has been something that has made this particular shooting different than the others. Unfortunately, in Sandy Hook, the students there were too young to know what to do or to be able to do anything. And I think that our students from Stoneman Douglas are very intelligent, they're very well spoken, as I think we've all seen, and they're tired. They're tired of being under threat, they're tired of being attacked. And they're standing up and they're saying, adults have failed us, our system has failed us, and we need to be the ones who are going to make the difference because no one's done it yet.
I hope that those students can, and those who believe in them will, not give up the fight. Clearly, from what's been proposed by the president and even this committee, they're not ready to tackle the obvious answers to some of these issues. We need to have more pressure. I recall meeting one of your students from the school at a television studio in New York a couple weeks ago, and I went up and recognized him and introduced myself. And he wasn't exactly in awe of my office because the first thing he said was, "Do you take money from the National Rifle Association?" And I said, "No." He said, "Where do you get your money?" I thought, that interesting introduction to a high school student. Not the kind of questions I usually run into, but their fearless approach to it, I'm sure turns some people off, but to me, shows the seriousness of their commitment, that they want to get to the bottom of this, they want answers, and they don't want political baloney. Too often, that's all we get.
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. First of all, Mr. Petty, thank you so much for being here. I know that it involves reliving the pain and grief that you've suffered in this very room. Parents of the Sandy Hook victims came to talk to us about their grief and pain in similar testimony, and nothing happened. Congress has been complicit, and its complicity has continued to cause deaths every day, 90 of them every day, this day in America on average. And my hope is that something has changed. Ms. Posada, not only because your students are intelligent and active, but the young people of America are saying enough is enough. The sign that one of them carried the other day, "Our blood, your hands." The thousands of them today, I just left them out on the front steps of the Capitol demanding change. The title of this hearing is "See Something, Say Something." We have to do something, not just talk about it, not just reality show rhetoric, which is respectfully what we're hearing from the White House, instead of real action. Mr. Petty, in your remarks at your daughter's funeral, you said about the shooter, "We wish and believe that if somebody had been able to put their arms around him and shown him some compassion and love to the extent that would have enabled him to get some help, things may have been very different last week." I know how much courage and strength it must have taken to say those words, and how much faith. But one of the proposals that we have in the Congress now, Senator Graham and I have offered it, would be a statute, red flag statute at the federal level, similar to the one that Florida has adopted, based on the Connecticut and Indiana models that prevent someone who is dangerous to himself or others from having or buying weapons. In that experience, more than half of the individuals whose guns are taken from them are able to receive mental health care. So they become less dangerous to themselves. And hopefully arms are put around them, speaking metaphorically, in the way that you suggested perhaps it should be done or should have been done for that individual. So let me ask you whether you feel that this kind of red flag statute at the federal level, similar to the one that Florida now has, but Florida is still in a handful minority of states that now have it, whether it would make sense at the federal level.
I believe it would. In Florida, we called it the gun violence restraining order. I think the one of the things that could have made a big difference here was, we've heard the testimony from the FBI. I've read the media reports about the response of the Broward Sheriff's Office. They visited somewhere between 30 and 40 times, and that investigation will continue. I believe that if we had had the ability to separate Mr. Cruz from his weapons, things could have been different. Things would have been different. The gun violence restraining order that we passed in Florida is a step in that direction, and I think it should be enacted at the federal level. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Never going to stop. We'll never solve this problem.
Senator Harris?
Thank you. Mr. Petty, I am so sorry for your loss, and you are really the best of who we are in terms of the courage that you are showing in the face of your personal pain. And it is clear to me you have decided that this will be a lifelong mission. And so I thank you not only for the courage you've shown in these last couple of weeks, but what I am very clear will be years and years of your leadership and advocacy on this. Mr. Beckerman, so you talked about AI, and the subject of AI, artificial intelligence, is in some ways a complex one, in some ways not. In that artificial intelligence is basically a series of algorithms which will be relevant to the extent that there is a large amount of data that is available to then inform that intelligence to help us make the right decisions. It's a function of data. So when we're talking about AI, really data is king or queen, I will say. And so we want, and because the data gives us then and gives AI the information that allows us to have some reference point based on experience so we can predict something that happens in the future, right? It's artificial intelligence, but it's just like teaching a child. They are exposed to information the first time, the second time, and then they have a wealth of experience that allows them to make good decisions about what should be something that they should be afraid of or something that they should be concerned about. Same thing for AI, data. So you've heard testimony today about the Dickey Amendment. The Dickey Amendment was an outright prohibition on the research of gun violence. And yet we know that gun violence is among the least researched major causes of death in the United States. So my request of you is that you have mentioned your member organizations. I'm familiar with them. A lot of them are in California. My request of you is that you will advocate, that your member organizations strongly advocate for the repeal of the Dickey Amendment so that you and we can have the research and the data that is available if we just study this thing to help us in every sector, including you with social media sites, having the data to inform AI to create the algorithms to help us detect the difference between some kid who is saying you killed it because they did well with a high school basketball game and the threat that you might actually be prepared to kill a classmate in school. Will you be willing to make a commitment to advocate among your members that the Dickey Amendment be repealed, and also that we support the kind of work that's happening, as we heard earlier from the Secret Service, the National Threat Assessment Center, to have what appears to be a renewed interest in studying this issue?
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate the question. We don't have a position in particular with the Dickey Amendment. I'm not all that familiar with it. However, I can agree with you that in this context and many others, that data is queen, and the more data we can have, the better it is for all of us.
So will you commit to taking it back to your members in a formal way, informing yourself and your members of the significance of the Dickey Amendment in terms of really not allowing us to have the research and therefore the data that we need to address the issue in a much more comprehensive way, and in particular through things like artificial intelligence, which is part of how we will be more productive and effective with policy and predictive policy?
I'll absolutely go back and take a look at it and discuss it with our members.
I appreciate that. Ms. Posada, again, you have been educated and obviously made a life commitment to teach our children and to, in that context, nurture their dreams and their spirit so that they can receive all of the education, including Shakespeare, and we can debate how much that will apply to what they end up doing. But you are extraordinary with your courage, and I really do thank you for that. And so you've spoke of the students at Stoneman Douglas and how extraordinary they are, and I couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. And so my question to you as an educator is, we see all of these kids throughout the country today who are taking their 17 minutes to go and honor the young people who have died, and to commit themselves to being a part of the leadership on an issue like this. What is your advice for us, the people who sit at this podium, who have these big bully pulpits? We have all these microphones in front of us all the time. What is your advice to us about what we should be saying to them to harness that energy that they are showing and that commitment they are showing to really believing in our democracy? And that's where I find a great deal of optimism. These kids believe that if they speak out and if they're heard and seen, we will do something. That makes me optimistic about our future. But what's your advice to us about what we can say to encourage them and support them with their engagement?
Well, I think my first, recommendation would be not to say anything but to listen. Listen to their concerns, listen to how they're feeling.
Yeah.
Don't dismiss them. I think that a lot of people have just said, oh, well, they're teenagers, what do they know? And I think that that is a mistake. So these, although they are children, they are intelligent and they know their minds, and they'll tell you what they think if you let them. So that would be my first recommendation. But just to encourage them, I know that a lot of these kids have been attacked personally by people saying that they're not real, or that, you know, I mean, that type of thing, I think in the long term may be very discouraging. So to keep that, you know, at a bare minimum, and just to allow them to speak their voice, because they're prepared to really take this, I think, all the way.
Senator Coons?
I think Mr. Petty wanted to just add.
Oh, he can sure do that. Go
Thank
ahead.
you.
I'm
would-
sorry, I didn't see that.
That's all right. I would just add one thing to that. Please don't let them down.
Yeah.
There was a stunt pulled in Tallahassee with the kids that didn't understand the procedural mechanisms in the legislature there. The Senate and the U.S. Congress are far more complex than Tallahassee. I hated to see the images of those kids disappointed because they were taken there for a photo op, and there was no chance of that particular amendment passing. So please be honest with them, listen to them, but please be honest with them. They're our future. They need to know they can trust you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Senator Coons. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Grassley. I'd like to thank my colleague for a line of questioning, and I'd like to continue that conversation with you if I could. Mr. Petty, thank you for coming to testify before us today and for working so tirelessly to make something positive out of your loss. I've heard from students up and down my state of Delaware. They've taken action today. I agree with you that we need to keep faith with that action. I just want to ask you, and Ms. Posada, if I might, given the law that was signed in Florida, that tackles things a little bit from both sides,
Yep.
isn't bold, isn't big, doesn't do what I'd like to see, but makes some progress on the gun violence restraining order and 3-day waiting period, raising the age to 21 and banning bump stocks. Do you believe we should mirror the actions that were signed into law in Florida? Are there aspects of that you disagree with, or are there things you might support that would go beyond that?
It's a great question, and let me say one thing. There's the walkout movement. There's also a movement called Walk Up that I think should get equal airtime. The Walk Up movement is where students go and put their arms around another student that's having trouble or is alone or isn't eating it doesn't have anybody to eat lunch with them. And I would encourage the students to not only walk out but walk up. Without getting into specifics, Senator, there were things about that legislation that I personally disagreed with. There were things that other family members personally that they disagreed with. There was enough in common that we decided to set aside those differences and come together, and I think we made some change. That to me is the model for going forward. There are things on the edges we're always going to disagree with. If we can just come together and say, look, and I think Ms. Posada said it well, we've got to quit impugning the motives of the other side. There are deeply held beliefs on both sides, and just because somebody holds a particular belief doesn't make them a bad person. We have to talk to them, we have to listen to them, we have to find common ground, and we have to come together. There are a lot of things in front of this Congress that are common ground that should be done quickly, and then you can continue to debate the things that you don't have in common.
Thank you, Mr. Petty, and my concern is that we will do nothing. The bill that I referenced before that I introduced with Senator Toomey is a modest, reasonable, bipartisan effort to enforce existing law, to make sure that when someone tries to buy a gun who's prohibited, that information is shared with state and local law enforcement. There's a dozen other proposals here that I think we should enact. Otherwise, we risk sending the message to families like yours, to you, to teachers, to faculty, to these students from around the country, that we're just not hearing them.
And I would absolutely support what you're proposing.
Ms. Posada, let me ask you the same question, and thank you for your testimony today and for your dedication to your students. My mother and grandmother both were public school teachers early in their careers, and I get a sense just how hard that job is. I also want to ask you a second question about school safety. There's a wide range of proposals from training teachers and arming teachers to trying to harden schools. There's a company run by a high school classmate of mine, Hardwire, that actually manufactures ballistic armor. And they deployed in one school district in my home state of Delaware, Colonial School District, with the help of State Senator Nikki Poore, clipboards and blackboards that look like any other clipboard or blackboard, so they don't create a heightened sense of instability or insecurity, but they are ballistic protective material. So it would allow, in an unexpected event with a shooter, it would allow a teacher or students to possibly exit with something between them and the shooter. I didn't know if you had any views on whether, what sorts of actions we should take to make schools safer, whether investing more in school counselors and mental health is the best path forward, whether equipping and training teachers is better, or whether these kinds of investments in school systems that would make them safer is best. I'd welcome your input.
Well, I think the problem with a lot of the proposals that have been made as far as arming teachers, what you just mentioned, those things that you just mentioned, the biggest problem that I see with those things is the cost. We as a nation seem to constantly be unable to invest in education, in the education of our children, but we're willing to spend millions of dollars on, arming teachers. For example, the bill that was just passed in Florida, I believe, allocates $67 million to the potential of arming teachers. When I know that the teachers in Broward County until this year hadn't had a raise for several years. So that's a large concern for me, that we seem to be willing to put lots of money towards things like that, but not towards education in general. I am personally strongly opposed to arming teachers. I think that it will pose much more of a danger on a day-to-day basis to teachers and to students. In fact, in the past few days, there has just been a teacher today in California accidentally discharged a gun in a classroom and injured a student. Yesterday, a teacher in Utah accidentally discharged a firearm and injured herself. These were trained teachers who were allowed to carry those weapons, and just in 2 days, these accidents have happened. So if we do this on a larger scale, I fear that those things would happen more and more. As far as, the Kevlar bulletproof items, sure, that would be a good thing to be able to have, but I think investing in education in general is a much more important step for the nation as a whole.
Well, thank you, Ms. Posada. Mr. Petty, as Mr. Petty mentioned, making sure that we're investing in school environments where there's limits on bullying and where there's resources, teachers and others for counseling, so that those who are isolated or at the margins of school communities are more engaged, are more supported, is something that I would see real value in. Making schools safer places, but also investing more in our teachers strike me as great priorities. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for holding this hearing today, and thank you to all of our witnesses.
Members, there's probably 21 different reasons why people could be here or not be here. So sometimes you get questions in writing, particularly from people that can't come, so I hope you'll respond to those, and we'll keep the record open for about a week for people to submit questions if they want to. And obviously all three of you should be thanked, but we couldn't help but sense the difficulty for Mr. Petty and Ms. Posada to present their case because they've gone through so much, so we thank you for doing that. And I think what the two of you have said, that we need to come together in the Senate to find a common ground and it seemed to me like the bills that are evolving here, things to improve school safety and to get guns out of the hands of dangerous people, and reducing school violence as a result, are things that we ought to really find common ground on. Beyond that, obviously, we still have a responsibility to find common ground, but it seems like we ought to be able to move ahead on some of these things very, very quickly. So thank you all very much, and the hearing is adjourned.